at the London School of Economics and Political Science. I will be chairing the last panel today. I hope we have saved the best till last. We have 4 panelists, so I think we'll need to be perhaps a bit more disciplined than might usually be the case. So could I ask all 4 panelists to speak for not more than 10 minutes each? Then we would hopefully have 10 minutes of discussion after each presentation. So altogether, according to my maths, it amounts to 80 minutes, so just short of the hour and a half that we have. Now, it's inevitable that we would overrun a bit, but I hope by not too much. As Dr. Bourgeois said at the end of the last panel, there would be opportunities to continue the discussion afterwards, but I'm keen to keep this panel to the allotted time. So, I would ask the panelists to present in the order in which they are listed in the program. So, our first presenter would be Kristian Kafozov.
Thank you, Dr. Dimitrov. So my name is Kristian Kafozov, or Kristian Kafozov, and I will be presenting about history. And I'm a student in the London School of Economics and doing a master's in the theory and history of international relations, but I will focus more on the history aspect of it, since this program is based in the Department of International History. Now, my master's thesis was inspired by Dr. Dimitrov's book on Stalin's Cold War, Soviet Foreign Policy, Democracy and Communism in Bulgaria, 1941 to 1948. And today I will present on a historical moment during one of the most dramatic decades in international history concerning diplomacy and strategy on the Balkans. This region of southeastern Europe has indeed manifested itself to be a phenomenon in both war and peace. Throughout world wars and in Europe, the global Cold War and the era of Pax Americana in the 1990s. It demonstrated once again its significance as a historical crossroad of civilizations, and indeed an excellent case study of conflict and peace strategic studies within the former Ottoman Empire. Now, the full title of my paper is not simply Balkan diplomacy, it's really an analysis of Bulgarian and Yugoslav diplomatic relations and their respective political party perspectives on the Soviet Union throughout the rise of communism in the Balkans. But what it's really about is post-war Soviet foreign policy in the Balkans at the start of the Cold War. Here, the confrontation from the Second World War did not end, but actually continued on the ground within the civil war in Greece, whose outcome resulted in the Balkans becoming a microcosm for the Cold War itself during the early start of tensions between the USSR and USA. Now, the paper examines the essence behind the post-war political process which allowed for the rise of communism in the Balkans within the context of the diplomatic relations between the Federal Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, formed in 1943, and the People's Republic of Bulgaria, formed in 1944, with respect to their plans for unification into a Balkan Socialist Federation, which failed in 1947. Here, I raise the question of how close their relations were to realization and attempt to explain the reasons of why they ultimately had failed. Now, this Balkan Federation almost reached its formation in 1947, but by 1948 was an impossibility in the aftermath of the Yugoslav diplomatic crisis. This was indeed the last and closest chance for the creation of this ideal of unification between the nation states of Europe's age-old powder keg. Since the disintegration of the Balkan League alliance during the Balkan Wars, consequently followed by the First and Second World Wars, The kingdoms of Yugoslavia, Bulgaria and Greece found themselves in constant conflict over the land of Macedonia because of its strategic location at the convergence point between 19th century great power spheres of influence, namely the British, Russian, German and Ottoman, all there. The most Balkan of the Balkans, we have Macedonia. However, the socialists proposed that the unification of Macedonia could act as a cornerstone for a Balkan Union, which would include Greece, Bulgaria, on the model of an already existent Yugoslavia, and that would act as the solution to the Macedonian question. Now, this was not a new idea, but this was the first time the idea had a chance to be implemented. Though it proved to be only that, an unrealistic idealism, but it only proved to be that, which was this unrealistic idealism that failed to end conflict and achieve unity. This was due to the conflicts of interest that existed in the interpersonal relations between the people in power in Moscow, Belgrade, and Sofia, and the role that they played in the convergence of social movements, namely the partisans in the Fatherland Front, the People's Liberation Front, the Nova, and the Avnoi, with political forces such as the Soviet, the CPSUB, CPY, and BWP. These are all the communist parties in Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria, respectively. And in their context of the relations between the influential organizations such as the Comintern and Cominform based within the USSR. Now, the main actors in foreign policy decision-making, I'm looking at the Bulgarian Georgi Dimitrov, who had been in charge from 1934 to 1943 and had proposed a solution to the creation of the Macedonian state, which we see manifest in 1945. Now, Dimitrov, as an individual, played multiple political roles, from an advisor to Stalin and an internationalist who coordinated the communists in the Chinese Civil War to the founder of the People's Republic of Bulgaria and main mediator between Yugoslavia on the formation of a Balkan Federation with Josip Broz Tito, his counterpart. Dimitrov today remains a controversial character who is remembered more so at his best for an anti-fascist ideologue during the interwar era, but later indeed a pro-Stalinist demagogue in the post-Cold War era. Balkan diplomacy between Dimitrov and Tito from 1944 to 1948, both under the influence of Stalin. Now, it's often noted by historians of Balkans in the Cold War that, in a way, Dimitrov and Tito reversed their roles as internationalists after 1948. Now, they had provided a chance for cooperation and dialogue on the question of a Balkan Federation. And this was first mentioned by the underground partisans directed by Moscow during the wartime talks in 1944, which envisioned the Soviet military muscle in the construction of a Bulgarian Yugoslav Federation by the end of 1945. Let's keep in mind this is the end of World War II. This was, however, postponed officially because of after the formalization of the post-war peace treaties in 1946, but in fact not initiated due to the presence of the Allied control commissions established by the Allies and former Axis states, Bulgaria being one of them, in the new this by 1946. And throughout 1947, Tito and Dimitrov signed the treaties in Bled on the Adriatic Sea and Varna on the Black Sea, which were the climax of Bulgarian Yugoslav wartime plans for a federation, where the Macedonian question was debated and indeed led to mutual suspicion about Yugoslavia being annexed into the Soviet Empire or Bulgaria being annexed into a Yugoslav federation. Between the summer of between the summer and the fall of 47, the plans were directed by Stalin, who was against an independent regional arrangement and who told Dimitrov that for Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, the external threat is decisive, not the internal, in reference to alerts from Anglo-American forces in Greece. Later, with approval from Moscow, they met and declared that this Balkan Federation would be formed in Varna. And these treaties did indeed consist of clear diplomatic plans and protocols for the future, which are the documents that I analyzed and assessed in the paper. But they were automatically annulled like that with the outbreak of the Soviet Yugoslav crisis, which began as an interpersonal conflict between Tito and Stalin in the winter of 1948 and was resolved with the creation of the Common Forum, Bureau, in order to control the communist parties, from which the Communist Party of Yugoslavia was excommunicated in the summer of 1948, while events in Europe already signaled the start of the Cold War. And so ultimately ended this culmination, this dream for a Balkan Union. Ever since its inception, this ideal for socialist federations saw its last chance for realization during the post-war rise of communism in the Balkans. These plans had begun during World War II from 43 to 45 and were gradually enacted in diplomatic relations between 46 and 48. However, ended with the onstart of the Cold War and remained as before from 1909, ever since the creation of the Bulgarian state, the unified Bulgarian state, to 1939, an unachieved dream consumed by ideological conflict throughout 1949 to 1989, and even later by geopolitical war from 1991 to 1999. In a political process meaning the complete opposite of unification, Balkanization. Now, I will go back to the initial question and conclude that although the plans in Bulgarian Yugoslav diplomacy from 1944 to 1948 to form a Balkan Federation had resulted in the closest possible chance to realization, the geopolitical realities in the region, along with the interest of the Soviet Union and its role in the future of the Balkans, exemplified by the Soviet Yugoslav crisis, also known as the Tito-Stalin split in 1948, resulted in an ideological balkanization that lasted throughout and indeed after the Cold War. And here I'm going to have to say that, again, Dr. Dimitrov's books on Stalin's Cold War, which offers an excellent and new reinterpretation of the post-war Soviet strategy and foreign policy in Eastern Europe, as analyzed within the case study of Bulgarian domestic politics. It inspired me to go on a tangent and look at what was happening in the region of the Balkans during this time frame, where there existed a democracy, but then it ended with the start of the Cold War. And we also have our character, Georgy Dimitrov, who Veselin Dimitrov analyzes in decision-making because of the fact that he had an quote-unquote, he had an unrivaled perspective on the policies of communist parties, not only in Bulgaria, but also throughout Europe and indeed the world, due to this unusually close relationship, special relationship between Dimitrov and Stalin, which allows us, nearly 70 years later, nearly 2 generations later, to better understand the historical reality there. Also for this paper was Marieta Stankova's new biography on Georgy Dimitrov, and the published diary by Ivo Banac at Yale. These were my secondary sources, and the primary sources were from the Державен Archiv, the State Archives, and the Archives of Yugoslavia, Archiv Yugoslavia, during the summer of, this is, actually the archives were in the process of prospertization, so I'm redoing a lot of this project. So thank you for your attention.
I would like to thank Kristian for his excellent paper and also for sticking to the 10-minute limit. That leaves us nicely with 10 minutes for questions. Perhaps it might be best if I collect a few questions and then let Kristian answer them. And then if we have time, we can repeat the exercise with a second batch of questions. Right, so any questions? Yes.
Sorry, I thank you very much. This is absolutely brilliant, and I will build a little on it in my presentation as well. But my question is about Milovan Djilas, his diary in Conversations with Stalin, well, which is not really a diary. What he tries to present his diary later on. Could you just speak a little bit more, because obviously it's written theologically years after the actual moments that it explains deep into the rift between Tito and Stalin. But what do you think is the historical validity? Because a lot of the information about the split is contained in Gilles' account, and what do you think is the historical validity? Because we cannot ignore it. But then, I was just wondering, how does it fit into your analysis of the rift and why the Balkan Federation never materialized?
Thank you. Yes.
Can I ask a question on the question? What's this diary? Can you please just clarify for the non-historians?
I mean, Milovan Gilles, one of the top leaders of Yugoslavia, wrote a book called In Conversations with Stalin, which was written, I wouldn't quote the date, but in early 60s. So years after the actual, Stalin died in 53, so we're talking here about the 40s period. And in this book, Gilles wrote a lot about what Stalin's views were on the Federation, or mostly about the encounters that Gilles himself had. How they traveled to Stalin's villa, how they, what happened, how they drank together, what Stalin said, etc. And all of that is, this is a key historical source on the key historical source, if I may say so, is Georgy Dimitrov's diary on Stalin and Stalin's entire, because that's actually a contemporaneous account on Stalin. But then Gilles is another source for the period.
Right. Any other questions? Well, perhaps I could abuse my position as chair and ask one question to Kristian. One of the things I've always wondered in a longer-term perspective is about the comparison between the integration that was attempted in the 1940s, which was based on having the same political parties in power in two countries, and the kind of integration that has been attempted by the European Union after 1989, which depends not on having the same parties in power, but having the same institutions in place across a range of countries. Now, if you think about these two modes of integration, how would you comment on their relative effectiveness? Now, I know this is a huge question, but I think we have to see the history of Eastern Europe under communism not simply as a sui generis period, as something that exists just for its own sake, but also as part of the longer-term historical development of the European countries. So I think in this context it is interesting to compare the ways in which integration was attempted in the 1940s and the ways in which it has been attempted since 1989.
Thank you for the two questions. On the Soviet Yugoslav crisis and historiography that emerges right after, Milovan Gilles was indeed present during the winter of 1948 in Moscow, when the origins really of the Soviet Yugoslav crisis began, and that unfolded from the winter throughout 1948 and ended with the Soviet Yugoslav crisis. Keeping in mind that at this time the Common Forum was being formed to coordinate the Communist parties of Europe, which indeed, they did have different interests and were in different positions. Some were enthusiastically came to power, like Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. Others, like in Czechoslovakia in 1948, came into power through a forced coup d'état. Others were completely in occupation, like in Poland and the GDR. So there's a difference. That the interesting comparison between Yugoslavia and Bulgaria is the fact that having the similar Southern Slavic, and also Southern Slavic culture, but besides the culture, also the geopolitical interests, they saw as having a regional federation, but the question was Greece. Now, Gilles was very close to Tito, and when he was in Moscow at that time, he recounted in the conversations of Stalin, I'm explaining the context, But he published this later on, along with also another book on the new class, which he criticized not the nomenclatura of the Soviet Union, but that of Yugoslavia itself under self-management. So he went even further to criticize a system which claimed itself to be a socialist, but within the Western sphere of existence. How this would fit into my paper now, I did mention, obviously, the conversations of Stalin and the fact that there we have the original, also compared to Dmitrov's diary, the revelation on Stalin's manipulation between the two, because he clearly changes his mind from time to time. At some points he says the federation should be formed right away, and other times he clearly says, be careful, don't scream too much about your eternal friendship with the Soviet Union, England and America are in Greece and Turkey, So it changes from time to time, but there's a point where Gilas and Kardiel, who is actually much more influential. Gilas is known later during Yugoslav non-alignment. He's very influential in non-alignment, but he's known to be more of a dissident later on. While Kardiel is very big, as a big actor in the formation of self-management. So obviously there is a cognitive bias there, the way that this emergingist historiography would play into the primary sources that happen at first, but not to turn this into a historical debate. I think obviously you have to consider the interest, and that leads to the other question, which I want to directly answer, and then go ahead and say what I think about the commonalities between the similar parties of similar ideologies at the start of communism were that they shared the same ideology, but not necessarily the same interest. What I see in the integration of the former communist space in Eastern Europe to the European Union is that although the parties are different ideologies, this is back in the 1990s, in the transition period, the interest tended to be the same, which was to first, in a way, actually become part of the European Union, but by becoming part of the European Union, first joining NATO. About the question of a federation is very relevant, because during the time, or at least a little bit later, after the Balkan countries were planning for a federation, we had the Western European Federation, which became the European Economic Community, and after the Cold War, the European Union as an intergovernmental institution. So that's a very fair comparison, though. It's a very guilty pleasure for historians to be in the business of making comparisons. We draw lessons from history and apply them to present-day circumstances. I would say that the interests tended to be the same. This is about the transition, not the European Union of today. This is a different story. Namely, when it comes to the Europeanization or the integration of the former Yugoslavia into the Western Balkans, which is called now, it's no longer former Yugoslavia, the Western Balkans into the European Union. So there's a lot of relevance there. Thank you.
I would like to